This headline could hardly be worse for the president. Bad enough that 3 senators said Nixon had told them he had a pullout deadline for Vietnam, something Nixon desperately wanted to hide. Worse, one of them was the Senate leader of the president's own party. Worst of all, that Republican senator tied the Vietnam pullout to the presidential election. The Washington Post reported that Senate Republican leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania said Mr. Nixon told congressional leaders, "I have a date in mind. I have a definite plan and timetable for terminating all U.S. participation in Vietnam." Scott said he believed it would be before the end of 1972, or another man may be standing on the platform when the next president is inaugurated.
Scott, at first, is so totally irresponsible. He sits in the goddamn meeting. He misses first, he tries to hear something and then to interpret it. He's not supposed to say anything, they're not supposed to go out and say goddamn word.
Trying to come up with some kind of response to the story, the president told White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler that he had an entire range of pullout dates.
We've got dates in mind. We've got dates everywhere from July to August to September, October, November, to December, to January, to 1973. Then I thought I'd go out and say that.
If the press secretary had gone out and repeated what Nixon just told him, it would have confirmed that the president's withdrawal timetable revolved around the next election. Nixon kept trying to come up with a statement, but he need not have bothered. The next day's newspapers had nothing. No follow-up. Life in the White House is often compared to life in a fishbowl. But fishbowls are transparent. The White House just looks that way. Here you see the president surrounded by reporters and cameras, outnumbered, all alone under the full-bore glare of media scrutiny. But the specific occasion this image immortalizes is a photo opportunity for the president to have his picture taken with a chart showing the number of American troops in Vietnam declining. A picture that conveyed the message that the president was gradually bringing the troops home, while revealing nothing of his plans to keep troops in South Vietnam long enough to delay its collapse until after Election Day. On matters of war and peace, national security matters that a president can classify top secret, the White House is less like a fishbowl and more like a bullhorn. Whenever a president says anything new about a war, just about every news media outlet will do a story on his new statement. This story only appeared because 3 senators told reporters that the president had said something new. The White House shot it down easily, simply by disagreeing with the senator's version. Unless the president or one of his closest aides admitted he was timing military withdrawal to the election, there was little the news media could do to cover the most important political and military story of this time. At this point, the biggest obstacle to Nixon's election-oriented timetable was efforts in Congress to force the president to bring the troops home sooner than was politically convenient. It was George McGovern, the South Dakota senator who ultimately won the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972, who led the effort to legislate a withdrawal deadline of December 1971, too soon for Nixon's political good. To kill withdrawal legislation, the president threatened to blame the loss of Vietnam on Congress. Before a select audience of his aides, Nixon relived one of his extortion sessions with House Democratic leaders.
I just want you to clearly understand that if there is any arbitrary date set, then I will have no choice but to put the responsibility on the Democrats in the House and the Senate, on them, for losing everything that we fought for in Vietnam and for bringing on a communist victory. So if you want to fight out on that date, we'll beat the hell out of it.
The president's power to influence public opinion gave his threats teeth. While his own pollsters found that Americans supported total withdrawal in 1971 by a wide margin, 63% to 28%, the White House could rephrase the question to get the answer it wanted. Would you favor total withdrawal this year, even if it meant defeat in Vietnam? Put it that way, the number saying yes fell below a majority to just 39%, outstripped by opposition of 45%. The White House had its pollsters try another question. Would you favor total withdrawal this year, even if it meant a communist takeover of South Vietnam? Support for withdrawal dropped to 27%, while opposition rose to a majority of 57%. Finally, they asked, would you favor total withdrawal this year, even if it threatened the lives and safety of American POWs? Support for withdrawal plummeted to 12%. and opposition rose to an overwhelming 71%. The polling data had revealed two hot buttons the president could push to turn support for withdrawal legislation into opposition.
Viewed everything is interesting, Bob, and also what you say about communist takeover. That's a good thing for me to remember. The communist takeover.
2 days later, Nixon answered a withdrawal question by pushing both hot buttons, twice.
It will be necessary for us to maintain forces in South Vietnam until two important objectives are achieved. One, the release of the prisoners of war held by North Vietnam in North Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia. And two, the ability of the South Vietnamese to develop the capacity to defend themselves against a communist takeover. Not the sure capacity, but at least the chance. Once those two objectives are achieved, then the total American withdrawal can be undertaken and will be undertaken. As long as the prisoner issue remains unsettled, and as long as they hold prisoners, and as long as the South Vietnamese have not yet developed the capacity to defend themselves, to take over from us the defense of our own country, a capacity that they rapidly are developing, we will have forces there.
This poll-tested answer worked like a charm. The next morning's headlines proclaimed the president's linkage of U.S. withdrawal to the POW's release and to the capability of Saigon, the seat of South Vietnam's government, to defend itself, nailing both hot buttons before the newspaper's readers even started the story. That night, NBC anchorman John Chancellor treated the president's statement like a revelation.
When President Nixon spoke last night in Washington, we got a clearer picture than ever before of how the end of the game may be played in Vietnam. He said Americans will be there until he determines that the South Vietnamese have at least the chance of defending themselves. And Mr. Nixon seemed to place perhaps primary importance on the release of the American prisoners.
Nixon's poll-tested message proved highly effective. Congress never did pass legislation to force the president to bring the troops home ahead of his political schedule. But his arguments against an end date employed sleight of hand. The president never had pollsters ask about his real strategy. Would you favor delaying withdrawal until election time, even if it meant prolonging the captivity of American POWs, even if it meant increased American casualties, even if South Vietnam was still going to collapse in a year or two? One Democrat accused the president of doing pretty much what the president was doing. Senator Ted Kennedy said the only possible excuse for continuing the discredited policy of Vietnamizing the war seems to be the president's intention to play his last great card for peace at a time closer to November 1972, when the chances will be greater that the action will benefit the coming presidential election campaign. How many more American soldiers must die? How many innocent Vietnamese civilians must be killed so that the final end to the war may be announced in 1972 instead of 1971? California Governor Ronald Reagan rebuked Kennedy for charging that the president was playing politics with the war, saying this is an irresponsibility. A Democrat also rose to the president's defense, and not just any Democrat. The former Vice President of the United States and the party's 1968 nominee for president, Senator Hubert Humphrey, who said, "I do not believe the president is playing politics with Vietnam. I may disagree with the president's policy. I do not disagree with his sense of sincerity or integrity." The president called his former opponent to say, "Thank you."
You got a little flack from your party. Just know there was one party down at the White House that was appreciated.
Well, I very much appreciate that, and let me say I did exactly what I would have expected you or someone like you to have done under the same circumstances.
There's no political mileage in anybody in keeping this going, you know that.
Of course not. We know that. We know that. My goodness, it isn't. If anybody wants to talk politics, it isn't even good politics.
That's right.
Next, the diplomatic opening to China gives Nixon a chance to secretly negotiate a face-saving decent interval between his final military withdrawal and the Communists' final military victory.